So, today I want to talk about evictions. The Federal Eviction Moratorium ended in late August due to the Supreme Court siding with landlords over tenants and the CDC. And within the span of just over 2 months, the amount of eviction proceedings have been on the rise, with more and more people being threatened with losing their homes and their livelihood. And all of this needs to be recognized for exactly what it is, part of a recipe for disaster. The conditions of the pandemic, in combination with slow rollouts on rental assistance due to the failure of government bureaucracy, in addition to the greed of landlords attempting to maximize their profit off of people's sufferings, have led to the conditions where people may be losing their homes en masse. And unfortunately, due to these circumstances of the way local municipalities collect data, in combination with less than legal proceedings that are occurring on a consistent basis, we don't even know the full extent of what is transpiring and just how many people are losing their homes. So, with that said, let's take a look at what exactly is going on. The New York Times put out an article with cases piling up and eviction crisis unfolds step by step. Evictions are rising nationwide. We don't know where the ceiling is, one expert said. And this is a terrifying statement in and of itself. The fact that we don't know where the ceiling is on this, we don't know exactly how far this is going to go, should be recognized as terrifying as it is. We don't know how bad this is going to end up. Now, when we go further into this, in Indianapolis, eviction courts are packed as judges make their way through a months-long backlog of cases. In Detroit, advocates are rushing to knock on the doors of tenants facing possible eviction. In Gainesville, Florida, landlords are filling evictions at a rapid pace as displaced tenants resort to relatives' couches for places to sleep or seek cheaper rents outside of the city. And that's not even counting the number of people who don't have relatives to turn to, and because of the evictions that they're going through, are not able to secure rents in cheaper places, if cheaper places even exist from where they're currently at. The problem is that once you're evicted, it becomes very difficult for you to get another place. Landlords will look at your prior history, and if you've been evicted before, chances are you won't be able to get another home. And if you don't have somewhere else to go and you don't have family to go to, where do you end up? Well, you end up buying a tent, and you end up trying to set up in a park or on a street and trying to survive that way. And that is really where a lot of people are headed, into houselessness and homelessness. What's emerging is a more gradual eviction crisis that is occurring, hitting communities across the country, especially those where the distribution of federal rental assistance has been slow and where tenants have few protections. So there are a number of cities that still actually have protections in place, but for the places that don't, it is getting more and more difficult for people to keep their homes. And the thing is, it's not happening in one swift motion. It's happening in waves, where a lot of landlords are seeing this as a spike where the Federal Eviction Moratorium ended. So a lot of people went directly towards that option of trying to evict people from their homes. Others may still be trying to work with tenants. But the fact of the matter is even with that happening, it may not be happening in one swift motion, but in fact, again, will happen over time in these waves where you'll have one set of landlords and then another set of landlords and another set of landlords. And because it's being backed up in a lot of the courts, it's taking time for these evictions to take place. But that doesn't mean that they're not piling up, and that doesn't mean they're not looming just because they're not happening all at once. And again, the lack of federal rental assistance and it being slow is causing a lot of the problems. Some landlords want to wait for that, others don't. And that means getting tenants out as quickly as possible. And even now, experts say the available numbers dramatically undercount the number of tenants being forced from their homes, either through court-ordered evictions or informal ones, especially as rising rents make seeking new tenants increasingly profitable for landlords. And this is something that needs to be addressed. We have a for-profit system where people buy up properties and are encouraged to buy up properties in order to rent them out to make money off of other people. So we have a system in place where this for-profit system incentivizes people to try to maximize the amount of money they can get off of people trying to pay for their home, which means that a lot of people are buying up properties strictly with the idea of, I can use the tenant to pay off the mortgage. And when these landlords use the tenant to pay off the mortgage, they are often charging rates at least at the level that the mortgage and utilities cost, meaning that the tenants are more often than not paying off the landlord's mortgage. The tenant is essentially doing that and has their income pretty much stripped so that the landlord can acquire property and value. Now, as we've seen a lot of the properties increase in value due to a lot of the increase in prices that we've seen as of late, as a lot of larger companies are purchasing more and more properties, what we're seeing is rents increasing. And rents are also increasing for other reasons, but that's one of the primary ones. And for all the reasons that rents are increasing, it's now becoming more and more of a beneficial situation for landlords to kick out the tenants that have been currently living in their spaces and to adhere to this sort of bubble that seems to be forming where these prices are going up and up and up so that they can maximize their profits and end up making as much as possible while the prices are high. And because of all of this for-profit system, again, people are, profiting off of people's suffering. And that is what happens when you keep something like housing, which is a definite necessity of people's lives, and you hold it as something to make profit off of. Now, going further into this, we know that just over 37% of all renters in the country live in places that still have local eviction bans or are proposing eviction judgments pending rental assistance, according to Urban Institute. Now, I very briefly want to stop over to this article from Buffalo News, which is talking about how even with this, there's still a lot of landlords in these places where eviction moratoriums are still in place, like in the state of New York, that are trying to make it so that a lot of the tenants can still be evicted because, quote, landlords are suffering tremendous harm. Their inability to evict tenants who assert a COVID-19 financial hardship has caused them to, quote, suffer tremendous harm, with some at risk of losing not only their rental properties but their own homes, according to the state Supreme Court filing. In any other industry, customers are required to pay for the goods and services they receive, one of the landlords said in the suit. But under the state's current rules, tenants need only file a hardship declaration that says they are unable to pay their rent. Tenants are not required to provide any proof that they've lost a job or suffered some sort of financial hardship. Now, here's the thing that I need to point out in this. Entering into being a landlord is part of being a business. It is a business venture. You are not guaranteed that your business will succeed. And so even under the rules of capitalism, there's no guarantee that you're going to thrive as a business. Furthermore, in all of this, the landlords, many of them still have numerous amounts of properties and are still making do. And a lot of them are crying foul when they're still getting payments and they're still getting certain amounts made to them. In addition to all of this, the fact has to be pointed out that there is no good or service truly being provided by a landlord. A lot of landlords will make the claim that they're providing housing for people, but the housing already exists. The only thing they do is own the property. You could argue that the only service that they do provide is that they potentially maintain the place, but people could easily do that off of the money that they often pay in rent. The good and service that they're providing is the ownership of a property that they ended up increasing the value on because they bought it so that somebody else couldn't have a home. And because a bank refused to give the tenants who deserve to live in that space the home or to allow them to pay off a mortgage on that home. As a matter of fact, the odd thing that often happens is that landlords end up getting it for a cheaper price than what tenants actually end up paying monthly for it. So in a lot of this, I don't have any sympathy for the landlords, who are also the ones who are being subsidized through a lot of these programs that the federal government is supposed to be adhering to. Now, as we go further into this, we do find that there is no national database of evictions, and the haphazard and patchwork local policies and record-keeping methods in courts across the country pose severe obstacles to creating one. 1/3 of all countries have counties have no available court eviction data at all, according to New America, a left-leaning think tank. And most rental tenants are forced to leave their rental units not because of formal eviction proceedings, but because they've been illegally locked out of their utility and their utilities have been shut off, or because they want to avoid an eviction being added to their record by leaving on their own. And again, what I mentioned before is a lot of people will leave on their own so they can rent in a cheaper place and not have that record held against them when a future landlord looks into things. Now, we have examples of this actually, where we have a case in Louisville, Kentucky. And this is one example, but you can find numerous examples like this if you just search through local news sources. He screwed the doors shut. Louisville man says he was evicted while in the hospital. One man in our area has suffered due to eviction. Everything was outside in the dumpster, said Cortez Simpson, who lives in Louisville. To everyone else, Simpson's lawn is littered with garbage, but to him, they're memories of his home he and his wife created, reflecting years of hard work. These are not people who aren't working hard. That's the thing that a lot of the wealthier people like to point out. Well, if they would just manage their money better, or they would just try to, work harder, then they could survive off of what they're doing. No, these are some of the hardest working people. The fact is that landlords are some of the least hardworking people. Many of them often do not, in fact, do anything to labor to create anything of value. And they end up skimming, again, a lot of the resources of the people who work for them. And especially when you get into larger landlords, what they're doing is buying up 50 to 60 properties sometimes, and then skimming all of the money off of those tenants, when they could just easily buy those properties and be able to mortgage them at the very least, but more than likely own them based on a much cheaper value if it wasn't for people constantly buying these properties to rent them out. So this person said everything was snatched. He and his wife, both in their 70s, spent the weeks at the hospital. First, she went in the hospital with pneumonia, he said. She's still recovering. He suffered a heart attack and now confronts a new diagnosis. I've been diagnosed with bladder cancer, he said. It's been a series of blows, he said, but the ultimate one came when he returned to the place and he and his wife had shared for 12 years. The landlord had screwed the door shut. And he said his landlord had locked him out and tossed his belongings outside. I even called him from the hospital. And this person was kicked out without any sort of proper eviction proceeding in place. He didn't give me no eviction papers, said Simpson, referring to his landlord. Simpson showed us a notice he received from his landlord to pay about $1,500 in rent, but the letter came about 2 weeks after Simpson said he was locked out. He should have given me some kind of heads up. And this is the kind of illegal proceedings that we're seeing. And it's happening in more and more cases, where we have situations, according to a 2015 study, that says in Milwaukee that there were 2 of these so-called informal evictions for every 1 formal eviction. Now, even if some of these do get filed in the courts, not all of them do. And a lot of them, people do run because of the threat of what might happen to them. And furthermore, some people just lock the door and throw the stuff out, which is illegal. Because these people are so worried about their property, which is again being held against people who live in these homes, while at the same time not valuing or caring about the property of the people whose homes that these are. A recent survey of low-income tenants in Washington state found that 1 in 5 tenants were subjected to a method of informal eviction during the pandemic, compared with 1 in 8 before the pandemic. So this is indeed on the rise. Now, we do have a bit of information about how bad all of this is, even if this is not proper data or cannot be fully collaborated on. And the assumption should be that this is worse than what we are reporting. According to Aspen Institute, more than 15 million people live in households that are currently behind on their rental payments. 7.4 million adults, 6.5 million households, which places them at legal risk for eviction. According to one estimate, these households collectively owe more than $20 billion to their landlords. On a per-tenant basis, average debt owed to landlords exceeds $3,000, which is significant variation based on the time away from work, family needs, and other factors. And I need to mention this as well. All of this money from these federal programs, when they are actually reaching renters' hands, are going straight to the landlords. They're not helping people with their other bills and expenses. It's not like people who need to be able to pay for food and medicine and any other expense, including transportation like a car, for them to be able to get to work, are getting those subsidized or covered. This is all federal money going to landlords if the landlords do decide to take it, and if the tenants do agree to it to keep these tenants in their homes. The tenants are the ones being subsidized by the government. They are the ones receiving care, not the tenants themselves. The tenants are not being provided a service in this regard. And according to the one eviction tracking service that I was able to find, Eviction Lab, over 600,000 evictions have occurred since mid-March, and over 5,700 of them have occurred just last week alone. And with all of this, it needs to be noted that these are just in 6 states and 31 cities. The fact of the matter is that because of the issues that I mentioned before about local municipalities not being able to cover everything and not having full access to data, there's no way to create a true federal tracking system. So this is the best we have at this moment, and this should be considered an underwhelming number. So we have places like Connecticut, Delaware, Indiana, Minnesota, Missouri, and New Mexico, and a lot of major cities, including ones that have not had eviction moratoriums removed, like Austin, Texas, Boston, Massachusetts, and New York City. However, it should be noted again that since the eviction moratorium ended, all of these numbers have been on the rise, which you can see from the red data at the end of all of these trackings. And the trend has been upward, and the data is current as of November 6th of 2021. And again, this is what we've seen during the course of the pandemic alone. And when we look into some specific local areas and what's been going on with this rental assistance money, we find that, say, in Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana, they still have over $910 million to cover rent for people that have fallen on hard times, but it hasn't made it into people's hands. The bad news is that a lack of experience running these large-scale assistance programs with long lists of people with too much documentation needing to be maintained and managed, and some errors by people who have been finishing the applications incorrectly has slowed down the distribution of funds. And the fact of the matter is this should have just been handed to people. This shouldn't have been done via a means testing system or any sort of way that could even create all of this backlog. But it did, and it has. And again, that's bureaucracy failing a lot of people. Further problems have been caused by some landlords who are unwilling to work with state programs due to past payment delays, or preferring to wait and see what happens first, or seeing if they could make more money off of all of this. And so we've seen this slow, steady rise in evictions since October, where in New Orleans, we've seen over 125 just in the first week of October. Mississippi's had an increase. A lot of these places have had huge increases. And what's really slowed a lot of this is that there's been more of a fear of fraud and more of a fear of people potentially not deserving it, getting access to it, than being able to put these monies in people's hands. And of course, the biggest issue is that it's going to the landlords and not the tenants, again. And the landlord problem is twofold. In one hand, some want to make sure they can get more money. And in some cases, we've had really bizarre cases where politics has been at play. In Louisiana, for example, some have denied the payments because they do not agree to certain program rules, like the one that prevents them from evicting tenants for several months after accepting the aid. The executive director of the Apartments Association of Greater New Orleans, said that the issue is that one of the biggest complaints she heard from landlords across the state is, in fact, that they would not be able to evict their tenants. Meanwhile, you've had some landlords even not cooperating because one lawyer mentioned in a case that a landlord turned down the money because he thought it was communist. This is the absurdity that we're dealing with here. Alabama lawyer Sarah Taggart represented a landlord who refused to let the program write him a check because he didn't want money from the Biden administration, despite the program getting passed at the end of the Donald Trump presidential term. The landlord eventually agreed to take the money directly from the tenant. So they actually had to have the money sent to the tenant in order for the tenant to pay the landlord, so that the landlord didn't get money directly from the Biden administration. And while this may be somewhat rare, these are the type of situations that we're seeing where a combination of politics, a desire to wait and see what happens, and potentially to evict tenants to potentially make more money in the future is culminating in all of these landlords not properly filing, even though a lot of this money already exists. Add to that the backlog of government assistance and all of the other situations that tenants find themselves in, and we end up with this disaster that we're currently looking at. So, in all of this, we need to recognize that we are seeing what is the result of a for-profit system failing, where some people continue to be incentivized to seek more money off the necessity of people to survive, and because in this system, people are going to lose their homes and their livelihoods due to the way things are functioning. And this is all just going to add to homelessness issue that is already rampant and already a major issue across the United States. And even with the reformist policies in place, state assistance is just coming far too slow for a lot of people to get protections. And some landlords are just flat out ignoring these potential protections in order to try to maximize their profits or for political reasons. And in all of this, again, there's no accountability to track just how bad the problem is, especially when it comes to illegal evictions. These rough estimates are just not enough. And things are going to get a lot worse in the coming months as we see wave after wave of this hit the courts and cases unfolding with more and more people being evicted from their homes. And the only thing that we can do truly is to stand together with our neighbors, to stand united and to try to come up with some way for us to keep people in their homes. Because otherwise, the government is going to be too slow. And a lot of these landlords are going to keep proceeding with these evictions, and the state is going to end up backing them up because of the way they recognize their for-profit interests over people keeping their homes and livelihoods. So with that said, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button and the bell for notifications. You can follow me on Twitter, check out my Discord, and subscribe to my Patreon. All of those links are in the description down below as well. With that said, my name is Anarchist Tara, and I thank you for watching.